Loyalists v. Patriots, and the American Revolution. Considered by many historians to be the first Civil War fought on American soil, John Adams famously declared that colonial Americans were divided into three equal groups: Patriots, Loyalists, and those who remained neutral to the conflict. Adams' equal division numbers may have been somewhat skewed, since by the end of the Revolutionary War, roughly 20% of Americans fought or sided with the British, while an estimated 30 to 40% of Americans called themselves Patriots. Scholars have also searched deeply for common factors that made Americans sway one way or the other, and while no credible evidence can be found relating to education levels, occupations, wealth, or social stratification, when Patriot Ben Franklin's son William proclaimed himself loyal to the Crown, father and son would never speak again. What can be gleaned from the war is that Scotch-Irish immigrants in newly settled backcountry regions distrusted Eastern Patriot elites and therefore sided with the British, while many religious groups such as the Quakers and the Mennonites remained neutral due to their pacifist beliefs. Many members of the Church of England, along with Presbyterians, however, chose the Loyalist side, while many neutrals remained that way under the belief that Great Britain's overwhelming strength and military prowess would ultimately win the day. After Royal Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore offered male slaves freedom should they take up arms for the King's cause, when British and Loyalist troops swept through the South in 1779, roughly 20% of the enslaved population took up arms for the British. As for free blacks in the eastern colonies, an estimated 5,000 men served in the Continental Army by the end of the Revolutionary War. With a total U.S. population of 2.5 million in 1776, by war's end, an estimated 6,800 Americans had been killed in action, with an additional 6,100 wounded and upwards of 20,000 taken prisoner. 17,000 more would die from the outbreak of infectious diseases, while 8,000 to 12,000 more died in British prison camps. As for Britain's losses, an estimated 24,000 to 25,000 British and Loyalist soldiers died during the Revolutionary War, including 1,700 Loyalists killed in action, while an additional 5,300 were lost to disease, making the Revolutionary War the first great divide in American history. Marquis de Lafayette. Born into a wealthy family in 1757 France, the Marquis de Lafayette, or simply Lafayette as he was known in the colonies, lost his father during a battle in the 7 Years' War, followed by his mother and grandfather, who both died in 1770, leaving Lafayette with little family, but a vast inheritance. Inspired by stories of the colonialist struggle against British oppression, Lafayette sailed to the newly declared United States in 1777, intent on joining the uprising. Initially rebuffed by colonial leaders, he soon impressed them with his passion and willingness to serve for free. Combined with his knowledge of line-style European warfare and his imaginative suggestions for skirmish tactics to combat the British, quickly allowed him to rise to the rank of Major General in the Continental Army. His first major combat duty came during the September 1777 Battle of Brandywine, when he was shot in the leg while helping to organize a retreat. General George Washington requested doctors to take special care of the wounded Frenchman, igniting a strong bond between the two men, which lasted until Washington's death. Following a hard-scrabble winter at Valley Forge, in May of 1778, he outwitted the British, who were intent on capturing him at Bunker Hill, and rallied a shaky Continental attack at Monmouth Courthouse to force a stalemate. After traveling to France to press Louis XVI for more aid, Lafayette assumed increased military responsibility upon his return to the American war effort. As commander of the Virginia Continental Forces in 1781, he helped keep British Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis's army pinned down at Yorktown, Virginia, while divisions led by Washington and France's Comte de Rochambeau surrounded the British in a flanking maneuver, forcing Britain's surrender in the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. Known as the Hero of Two Worlds, after returning to his home country in December 1781, Lafayette rejoined the French army and organized trade agreements with Thomas Jefferson, the American ambassador to France. With the country on the verge of major political and social upheaval, Lafayette advocated for a governing body representing the three social classes and drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen with the help of Thomas Jefferson. Named commander of the Paris National Guard as violence broke out in 1789, Lafayette was obligated to protect the royal family, a position that left him vulnerable to the many factions vying for power. He fled the country in 1792, but was captured by Austrian forces and held prisoner until 1799. After Charles X was overthrown during the July Revolution of 1830, Lafayette was presented with the opportunity to become dictator. The aging statesman demurred to let rule pass to Louis Philippe. Following a battle with pneumonia, he died on May 20th, 1834, making Lafayette an important crossover between two historic revolutions. Minutemen. Following the Pequot War of 1636 to 1638, leaders in the New England colonies began to recognize the need for a fast response company within a given town's militia. And while men between the ages of 16 to 60 were generally required to participate in their local militia, as early as 1645, elite companies of training bands were chosen for their youth, enthusiasm, political reliability, and physical strength. Renamed Minutemen for their ability to turn out rapidly for defense emergencies, so named for their "at a minute's notice" mantra, Minutemen were selected from the general ranks of a given town's population, and while they generally made up a quarter of a militia's ranks, all town-centric Minutemen and militiamen found themselves fighting alongside relatives and friends. While most town militias accepted able-bodied men up to 60 years of age, Minutemen companies required their members to be less than 30 years old. And while Minutemen received additional training beyond that of militiamen, after the French and Indian War, all militiamen trained 2 to 4 times a year, until friction with the Crown in the 1770s increased militia training to 3 to 4 times a week. Minuteman training demands reached its zenith after the powder alarm of 1774, when militiamen called out to block a column of British regulars from seizing arms at Cambridge and Charlestown, failed to engage the British before their safe passage back to Boston. Considered precursors to elite fighting units such as the Navy SEALs, the Green Berets, or the Rangers, Minutemen companies were generally made up of at least 50 men each, electing their old field commanders and subalterns, before forming up in battalions brought together from multiple New England communities, becoming a body distinct from the rest of the militia that proved to be instrumental fighting units during the course of the Revolutionary War, making colonial Minutemen some of the first defenders of a nation's ongoing fight for democracy and freedom. The Mutiny of the Pennsylvania Line. Considered the most successful and consequential insurrections during the Revolutionary War, on January 1st, 1781, the soldiers of the Pennsylvania Line held a raucous New Year's Day celebration. That evening, soldiers from several regiments armed themselves and prepared to depart the camp without permission, complaining of low pay, horrendous living conditions, and a mass insistence that their 3-year enlistment period had expired. Officers led the remaining orderly regiments to quell the uprising, but after a few warning shots by the mutineers, the orderly regiments crossed the line. Captain Adam Bidding, commander of Company D, 4th Pennsylvania Regiment, was fatally shot by a mutineer who was attempting to kill a lieutenant colonel. As a result, all 11 regiments under the command of General Anthony Wayne abandoned the Continental Army's winter encampment at Morristown, New Jersey. When the English caught wind of the mutiny, British General Henry Clinton sent emissaries from New York to meet with the mutineers, offering full pardons as well as full pay in exchange for joining the Redcoats. Instead, the men turned south toward Princeton, which they captured on January 3rd, setting up temporary headquarters before commissioning a board of sergeants led by William Bozar. General Wayne followed his errant soldiers to Princeton, and when he had listened to their grievances with a sympathetic ear, the mutineers showed their ongoing patriotism by handing over Clinton's men for eventual execution. On January 5th, the Supreme Executive Council of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania learned about the mutiny and immediately dispatched Council President Joseph Reed to resolve it. That same day, George Washington issued a circular letter to the Continental Congress, begging yet again for material aid to the Army, citing the soldiers' deplorable living conditions that led to the mutiny at the Pennsylvania line. Knowing the mutineers would have public sympathy on their side, the government had no choice but to negotiate. Talks went rapidly as soldiers distilled their grievances down to one primary issue: that men who had enlisted in 1776 and 1777 be immediately discharged, at the same time given the opportunity to re-enlist for a new bounty of $20 if they so desired. Half the men accepted discharges, while the other half took furloughs coupled with bonuses for re-enlistment. Those who eventually did re-enlist formed the Pennsylvania Battalion, which went on to participate in the Southern Campaign. The excellent terms prompted 200 New Jersey soldiers stationed at Pompton to follow suit with their own mutiny. Only this time, the response was different when General George Washington ordered New England soldiers to disarm their New Jersey compatriots before executing 2 of the leading mutineers. Native American governance and the U.S. Constitution. When the Founding Fathers met at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 to debate the future of American governance, they had no contemporary European democracies to model themselves after, other than the ideologies and writings by the likes of John Locke and Montesquieu. They did, however, have frequent interactions with Native Americans, including Cherokee chiefs dining with Thomas Jefferson's father in Williamsburg, and interactions between Philadelphians and the Delaware and Iroquois Indians, leading historians Lynn and Kirk Kickingbird to write that to think that the constitutional framers weren't familiar with Native American democracies was like saying, "Gosh, I didn't know the Germans and the French knew each other." While other indigenous peoples had their own brand of democracies between like-minded tribes, the most pronounced and evolved example for Founding Fathers to study was the Iroquois Confederacy, which dates back to 1722, when the Mohawks, Onondaga, Cayuga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations formed a multi-state government in tandem with their own individual governments, much like the American states of today. According to Bruce E. Johansson and Donald A. Grinn, Jr., co-authors of Exemplar of Liberty, Native Americans and the Evolution of Democracy, the constitutional framers cite the Iroquois and other native governments as examples of federalism, where subjects like marriage and divorce were handled within a given village, while a national confederation of chiefs dealt with issues of mutual defense in foreign affairs. Other examples include a letter written by Ben Franklin in 1751 describing the need for the 13 colonies to form a voluntary union similar to that of the Iroquois Confederacy, while John Adams' 3-volume handbook, written for the constitutional framers as a survey of different types of governments, included references to the Iroquois Confederacy and other indigenous forms of democratic governance, making the Iroquois Confederacy a foundational primer for the U.S. Constitution. Native Americans and the Revolutionary War. Often minimized and misunderstood by historians, Native Americans weighed in heavily during the Revolutionary War. And while the majority of Native communities remained neutral in the fight between Britain and her breakaway colonies, most believing the conflict to be little more than a family dispute between the king and his subjects, many others made the tough decision of choosing sides and taking up arms. While the Proclamation of 1763 made lands west of the Appalachians off limits to European settlers, a royal decree which angered westward expanding colonials, Native Americans who participated in the French and Indian War taught young leaders like George Washington the effectiveness of their warfare tactics when they frequently acted as scouts for European armies while launching devastating raids on colonial frontier outposts. Early on in the war, the Native community at Stockbridge, Massachusetts, sent 17 men to join the Patriots during the Siege of Boston in 1775, while other Native Americans sided with the British to defeat the Patriot invasions of Canadian outposts in 1775 to 1776. Frequent disputes erupted within Native American communities regarding which side of the conflict to support, including the Cherokee Nation and the Six-Nation Alliance in New York known as the Iroquois Confederacy, which saw the Oneida and Tuscarora people side with the Americans, while the Mohawk Nation fought beside the British. Britain's many frontier outposts, such as Fort Niagara and Fort Detroit, became ever more important lifelines for Native Americans, which in turn encouraged many indigenous people to fight for the British alongside American Loyalists forced to flee their own communities, leading General George Washington to dispatch General John Sullivan into Iroquois country in 1779, with the goal of destroying native villages and crops, earning Washington the nickname Town Destroyer in the Iroquois. While the war cost Britain her prized possession in North America, the conflict also came with a high cost to Native Americans, since by recognizing American independence with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Britain's proclamation of 1763 became null and void, opening the floodgates of European-American westward expansion that in turn led to an escalation of the American Indian Wars, which would rage intermittently until 1924, making the Revolutionary War a major downturn for Native Americans' ever-weakening grip on their once exclusive lands. Patrick Henry. Born in 1736, Hanover County, Virginia, as a young man, Patrick Henry taught himself law while working as a tavern keep at his father-in-law's inn, opening a law practice in 1760 that soon flourished due to his adept skills as a legal scholar and orator. Henry's first major case was known as the Parsons Cause of 1763, which has since been viewed by historians as an important precursor to the American Revolution. In the case, ministers of the Church of England had historically received their annual salaries in pounds of tobacco. However, when a severe drought in the late 1750s inflated tobacco prices to 6 pennies a pound, the Virginia legislature passed the Two-Penny Act, which reduced ministers' income to 2 pennies a pound. When Britain's King George III overturned the law upon clergy appeal, Henry's impassioned speech against British overreach elevated the young attorney's importance within the independence movement. After Great Britain passed the Stamp Act in 1765, intended to help pay down the growing cost of defending the American colonies, Patrick Henry responded with a series of resolutions introduced in the Virginia legislature which helped articulate America's stance against taxation without representation. In a series of speeches, Henry argued that Virginians should pay no taxes except those voted upon by Virginians themselves, at the same time flirting with treason when he hinted that King George might well suffer the same fate as Julius Caesar should he maintain his oppressive policies over the colonies. In a 1775 speech before the Second Virginia Convention, held to discuss strategies against the British, Patrick Henry delivered his now famous speech, which ended in "Give me liberty or give me death." The speech was heard by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and 5 of the 6 other Virginians who would later sign the Declaration of Independence, which in turn convinced the Virginia legislature to prepare troops for war against Great Britain. During and following the Revolutionary War, Henry would serve as Virginia's 1st and 6th governor, becoming an outspoken anti-federalist, opposed to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, as well as limiting the power of the federal government, which he feared could evolve into the same kind of monarchy he and his Patriot brethren had fought against in the first place. His authorship of several anti-federalist papers would become instrumental in shaping the Bill of Rights, which comprised the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, further clarifying individual liberties, while placing additional limits on the powers of the federal government. He passed away on June 6, 1799, from stomach cancer, ending the life of one of America's most influential founding fathers.